Good morning, I'm Wayworn Worm, and welcome to my channel. Today we're going to talk about the Missing Enigma's new Trenny Gibson video called The Trenny Gibson Disappearance May Have Just Been Solved, new evidence. I say new because at the time I am writing this, the video has been live for about 8 hours. At the time of recording, it has been closer to 2.5 weeks. So if I don't hurry up, it won't be his newest video anymore. But specifically what I want to talk about is the interview Zoom call segment of this video, where in the first half he interviews Hope, formerly Gibson, and then in the second half he does Michael Bouchard. Because this whole interview, both sections of it, made me so angry I had to write this. Editing worm here, just kind of jumping in. There's some sort of tinniness that has infected this video and the next. I don't know what's causing it. I've spent a lot of time trying to chase it down. I have even re-recorded this entire video more than once because of just how bad the audio quality was, because of this tinniness and isolating background or taking out background noises, and or leveling doesn't seem to be doing anything to get rid of it. In fact, it's degrading the audio quality even worse. I have no idea why any of this is happening, but yeah, there we go. Yay. Sorry, everyone. This is the first in two videos where we're going to be talking about the Trenny Gibson disappearance back on October 8th, 1976. I'm pretty sure that Nick, aka the Missing Enigma, created this video, be it on purpose or not, although I do tend towards on purpose, to act as a promotion for Michael Bouchard's new book, Trenny, The Disappearance of Trenny Lynn Gibson. As a complete sideline, real quick, a tiny bone I have to pick with the release of this book. He released it 49 years to the day from when she went missing. Like, what the fuck, dude? Just release the book on October 8th, 2026. Sure, you miss out on a year of potential book sales, but then you can hype it all up to be like, you discovered just in time for the 50th anniversary how what happened to her. Which I don't think he did, but whatever. Now, before I get into this, I want to state just right up front, I like Nick. I really do. Soon after I was introduced to his videos, I watched most of his backlog in a almost embarrassingly short amount of time. I subscribed to him and have, with one exception that we're going to get into a little bit, watched every video that I know of that he's released since I subscribed, just all the way through. In this video, where we're going to be talking about Hope's part of the interview, I really don't understand why Nick keeps talking about how sharp she is. Honestly, she doesn't really impress me. I completely disagree that at least during this video, I don't think she comes off as sharp at all. In fact, in a couple of places, I'm going to be pointing out where I think there's some pretty strong evidence that she's not sharp, and I don't feel good about it, but both Nick and Bouchard put so much on so much credit, and like the basis of Bouchard's idea kind of requires Hope to still be really sharp and very accurately remembering things. But finally, talking about Hope, kind of before we get into this, I I don't think she adds anything worthwhile to the story. Not now, almost 50 years after it happened. In 1976, sure, she had lots to add. In 1980, probably. 1990, yeah, still probably had quite a bit to add. Uh, in 2025, in I think 2023, when Bouchard started interviewing her for this book, I don't think so. I don't think she has anything to add now. But we'll get into all of that. Since this whole interview kind of revolves around Bouchard's pet idea, let's kind of go over that real quick. His pet idea is that a classmate of Trenny's, a guy named Robert Simpson Jr., assaulted and killed her before disposing of her body. I'm gonna say it right now, and I'm gonna say it again later. I do not give two flying fucks about Robert Simpson Jr. He's dead. Most of the people involved in this story are dead. He doesn't. Yeah, it's just I don't care about him in the way that I don't care about most people who have ever lived. But I find the idea that he murdered Trenny Gibson, especially how Michael Bouchard claims he did, to have about as much credibility as the idea that an invisible Bigfoot came out of a UFO and snatched her. In other words, I don't think it has any credibility. What first made me want to write something about this, and I did leave a decently long comment on the video, on Nick's video, when I was about a third of the way through watching, was how much of this pet idea that Bouchard has rests on the testimony of Hope, almost half a century after Trenny went missing. And remember, Hope is Trenny's mom. Then I watched more of the video, and Bouchard just annoyed the shit out of me because of how bad his reasoning is. Not only was he setting off my bullshit detector in a way that really only David Paulides does, but it also really reminded me of Netflix old Making a Murderer. Like that old Netflix, was it a documentary? I'm not quite sure. It's kind of the start of the modern true crime. In order for him to be the murderer, and keep in mind, we do not know that Trenny was murdered, but for Robert to be the murderer, in some areas he has to have acted as a super genius who's doing everything to make sure he never gets caught, and in others he has to be a complete dumbass who couldn't be more suspicious if he tried, and to the point where he's like trying to get caught. You can't do both of those. Now, a majority of this video is going to be me playing a clip of the interview section of Nick's video and then jumping in to respond to it. I'm basically going to put the interview into two overall parts. I wrote that before I decided to split this into two videos. This first part is the interview where Hope, again formerly Gibson, is on the call, and why I don't think she has anything useful to add to the discussion about Trenny Gibson's disappearance. I'm going to say this now, and I'm probably going to say this again as I'm responding to her. I don't think Hope is lying or being malicious or anything like that. I think she's an old woman who lost a teenage daughter almost 50 years ago, and at some point in those almost 50 years, she decided to blame Robert Simpson Jr. for her tragic loss. And I think those two facts have altered her reality to create the truth as she sees it. All of that is a super normal thing to have happened, and I don't want to imply anything else, but I don't think what her truth is matches particularly closely with what actually happened in some really key areas. And we'll get into all of that. The second part of this, the second video, will be the part of the interview where it's centered around Michael Bouchard. Now, I don't give Bouchard the same grace I give Hope. I think he came into this case using his police training, looked at it, decided a crime happened, or maybe he decided a crime happened before he looked at it, or before he came into the case. And then he built a case the way a police officer would to find a suspect. In other words, I think Bouchard's big thing is he assumes a crime happened, therefore there must be a subject, and then he kind of goes from there. And now that he has a suspect, he has written about it and has a financial stake in Robert Simpson Jr. being the murderer of Trenny Gibson. Nick has said a couple of times in his video that Robert Simpson Jr. is dead, and it would make sense that Bouchard is doing all of this now, like releasing his book and going and doing interviews and such about it, because with Robert dead, he can't sue Bouchard. I'm not sure when Robert would have died. He is mentioned as still being alive in his father's obituary from October 18th, 2021, so he must have died in the last couple of years. One last thing before I kind of get into all this. This one is about Nick himself. As I mentioned earlier, I've been a subscriber of his channel for a while now, and by and large, I'm really impressed by his research and the critical thinking he puts into his videos. Unfortunately, that said, 2 out of his last 3 videos have essentially been interviews, and both of them have really disappointed me. Both of them have been essentially promotions for books, this one and the one on Stephen Kabaki. Which the interview on Stephen Kabaki is the one that is that video I mentioned that I didn't watch all the way through. The critical eye he has for research doesn't seem to go for at least these 2 interviews. Or if he still has that critical eye, he just doesn't show it. Yeah, I couldn't make it all the way through the Stephen Kabaki video. But if I had been in charge of that video, of making that video, once I saw that interview footage for both Stephen's sake and my own sake and the sake of the host, I wouldn't have published it unless there was a lot of money changing hands. If there's only a small or moderate amount of money changing hands, I would give it back. Okay, I lied. This is the last thing before I get into it. It's going here because I don't know where else to put it. As you've likely already noticed, I'm referring to Trenny's mom, Hope, by her first name, as well as Nick, while I'm almost exclusively referring to Bouchard by his last name. Part of it is because I am unsure of both Hope and Nick's last names. Part of it is Bouchard is a cop, and cops in the military tend to use last names instead of first names. And part of it is because that first names imply a closeness while last names don't. I'm very fine with an implied but ultimately false closeness between myself and both Nick and Hope. while I'm not fine with with an implied, but again, ultimately false closeness between myself and Bouchard. I wanted to make sure to spell all that out because there's a trend of referring to women by their first names and men by their last name or their full name, and that can get into quite complicated respect dynamics and sexism. And I wanted to just kind of be like, hey, this is why I'm doing this. One final note, I'll probably be referring to Trenny exclusively by Trenny because I'm not going to keep saying Trenny Gibson. And several people in the story, at least in the 1976 section, have the same last name as her, and a few others have a very similar last name. Now, Nick spends about 31 minutes going over the background of the case. I'm just fully cutting that out because we don't need it. And I'm not going to show you his entire video. It's going to be linked down below. Please go watch it at some point, preferably after this because I want you to finish this first. In case you have gotten this far into the video and don't know the Trenny Gibson story, or you just need a refresher, here is what we know. On October 8th, 1976, 33 high school students traveled to the Great Smoky Mountains as part of a field trip. There's only one teacher to keep track of them. Unclear if there's a bus driver or not. As in, like, did the teacher drive the bus? Was there a bus driver who stayed with the bus and didn't go on the hike? All unclear. Apparently, no one on the trip or their parents or anything like that were told where in the Great Smoky Mountains they were going until that morning. And the plan was to do an out and back hike that should take them about 3 hours, maybe 3.5 with lunch. There were threats of bad weather that caused some confusion in the morning about if the trip was going to be called off or not. All of the students were supposed to be back at the bus in the parking lot they started in at 3:30, and at 3:30, during that head count, it was discovered that Trenny was no longer with the group. The teacher and one student each checked down a trail, 2 different trails, that Trenny might have gone on if she'd missed the turn off into the parking lot. When it became clear that that's not what happened, some of the students had an older couple that happened to be in the parking lot informed the National Park Service rangers. By 8 p.m. that night, the search had begun and her parents had arrived. Trenny was never found. That's it. Less than 200 words to describe almost everything that is solid that we know happened. And I could probably trim that down quite a bit. Robert Simpson Jr. is involved insofar as we know for sure because he's one of the 33 students that day. He and Trenny sit next to each other on the bus ride, and allegedly because she did not bring a coat, he lets her borrow his. At some point, he gets his coat back, and he's one of 4 students from their school that helps search for Trenny. Almost everything else in this case, and things that will be presented here today, is either conjecture, can't be verified in any way, and or comes from a single source. And most of the stuff, especially that comes from a single source, comes through the testimony of Hope 49 years after the fact.
The main thing I wanted to start with is Trenny's relationship to Robert Simpson Jr., because that's always been a bit of a confusing topic for those who know about Trenny's case. It's often said that they were friends, but what do you know about it? That they hang out much? What was their relationship like?
They had no relationship. She had never even mentioned him. There was no relationship. They went to the same schools. He was friends with Bob Jr., and he came over one time to go to the ball game with Bob Jr. He was there not more than 10 minutes. I could take you to the spot if we were there right now where he stood at the bar downstairs in the kitchen, okay?
Okay, we're starting off with what is Trenny's relationship to Robert. This bit is a really important bit to peg down. What Nick is asking is, were they friends? Did they just know each other? Or what? I think Hope understands that, but I wanted to point out that there might be some slight confusion due to his wording. Either way, her claim is at this time, Trenny and Robert didn't know much about each other. Trenny had never mentioned Robert to Hope before. Hope expands on this, saying that Robert and her son, Bob Gibson Jr., who we'll call Bob, were friends, but Trenny and Robert didn't know each other. She says that Robert had only been to their house once to wait for Bob so they could go to a ball game together, and he was only there for 10 minutes. Hope says if they were all at the house, she could show the people on the call exactly where Robert stood by the bar in the kitchen for the entire 10 minutes he was there, that one time. I fully believe that she only remembers Robert going to their house once before Trenny went missing, and that he was only there for a few minutes, and that he was in the same spot the entire time. Baked into what she's saying, and we'll kind of get more into this a bit later, is the implicit idea that Trenny didn't go to that ball game with her brother, and Bob and Robert never hung out as a group of three or a group of four with Trenny's slightly younger sister. Basically, what I want to make very clear here is Hope is laying down solidly that Trenny and Robert were strangers who happened to know one person in common and went to the same school. I'm making a big deal out of this because according to Nick, and somewhat according to Bouchard, this entire idea about Robert killing Trenny rests on what Hope lays out. Both because this is the first firm stance she takes, and because it does not mesh well with a few things later. I want you to remember at the start of this interview, Hope says Trenny and Robert do not know each other and have no relationship of any kind at all whatsoever.
But anyway, no, sir, there was no relationship, but she was just with him because she felt like he could. She trusted him to protect her, something in that order, because she'd never been anywhere by herself, okay? She went nowhere by herself. She was always with her brother and her sister, or just her sister.
I forgot how immediately Hope said something that didn't fit with her first sentence. How quickly that came. Right after she finishes saying how Trenny and Robert didn't know each other, she says that on the day of the field trip, Trenny picked being around Robert because she trusted him to protect her. Hope says this is because Trenny had never gone anywhere in her entire 16 years of life by herself. She was always either with her older brother Bob, 3 years older than her, and her sister Tina, 2 years younger than her, or it was just Trenny and Tina. Once again, while I fully believe that Hope believes Trenny never ever a single time in her life went somewhere just by her little old self, I don't believe that's factual for a bunch of reasons, some of which we'll get into a little bit later, but okay, sure, I don't know a single person, let alone woman, who was a teenager in the US in the 70s. But I do have several great aunts who were teenagers in the 60s, and several aunts and my mom who were teenagers in the 80s. by and large, the only real difference teenage women in the 60s and 80s have with women who were teenagers at the same time as me in the 2000s is that women who were in the 60s and 80s seemed to have more freedom of movement, less overall freedom, but more freedom of movement, and they were home less often. Two more things do stick out to me about this. Hope is just short of outright saying that on the day she went missing, Trenny needed a protector like she always did. I just find it hard to believe that when it was just Trenny and Tina, Tina was taking on the role generally taken by the older child and was protecting Trenny. I'm sure it was the other way around. On top of that, if Trenny was always only going out with her brother and or sister, it makes it harder for me to believe that Trenny never hung out with her siblings' friends. Which, remember, Robert is a friend to Bob. Which makes it very hard for me to believe that Trenny and Robert never interacted before that day outside of the house. And also, why did she pick Robert if they didn't know each other? Like, it just... those don't seem to fit very well together. I'm going to skip the next half a minute because all that really happens is Nick confirms that Trenny never talked bad about Robert to Hope, and Hope says that even if Trenny had thought anything bad about anyone, she would have never said it. It was just not the kind of person she was. We don't really need to cover every second of this interview, and I don't... We're going to get into it more, but I don't believe that Trenny is the saint that her mother makes her out to be.
So on the day that Trenny disappeared, you gave her a ride to school, correct? And then when you dropped her off at school, you handed her a comb, right? And then she went inside to go make sure that...
was the last thing that I got to do for her, besides kiss her goodbye, was to hand her comb. I purchased one for her, one for her sister, for a 7.5-inch comb from Stanley.
This comb that Hope is starting to talk about is very important. This is one of the key pieces that Bouchard claims links Robert to this whole case in a criminal way. What she just said is something I want to make sure that we note down because this is really important. Hope just said that she bought Trenny and Tina black 7-inch combs from Stanley. I assume Stanley is either a brand or a store. When I try to Google it, I don't get any results. The whole Google getting noticeably worse in the last 5 to 10 years. But it does try to help me by suggesting I search department stores from the 70s that don't exist anymore, which seems to imply that Google knows that Stanley's a department store from the 70s, but because no one is doing search engine optimization for Stanley, we're just not getting results. But I think with that suggestion, I think it is safe to say that Stanley's was a store of some kind, whether it be a department store, a grocery store, a supermarket, whatever. I also think it's safe to assume that if Hope could buy 2 copies of this comb, one for each of her daughters, then any other person in the area could have bought this same comb as well. Honestly, this comb is treated like the knife from 12 Angry Men, where a supposedly absolutely unique knife is involved in the trial that movie centers around. And a really big point in that movie is, well, because the kid had this unique knife, obviously he's the murderer. And then Henry Fonda's character, one of the jurors, um, but brings out that exact same unique knife and says that he bought it in the area that the kid lived in for $5. I think this is that moment, except done accidentally.
And I handed it to her. Yes, sir. Last thing I got to do for her
And
before she shut the door.
well, she ran inside the school, right, to make sure that the field trip was still on. And then did she come back outside with Robert Simpson and she was wearing his coat? Is that how it went?
Okay, she walked inside the door. I was sitting where I could see her go all the way to the door, which was about 30 yards away, 25, 30 yards away from me. And she went in to see if it was still on. Yes, sir. And she came back out with him wearing the coat. Okay, I watched her all the way till she got to me, watched them both. And that coat swallowed her whole. It came almost to her knees, okay? It was open, it was a zipper coat, okay?
This bit kind of covers two things that I want to talk about. The first is that Hope is being very specific in the last two things she did before Trenny got out of the car. And that was to hand her the comb and then to kiss her goodbye. There is a slight discrepancy in the order of things. Sometimes she said she hands Trenny the comb, then kisses her goodbye. Sometimes she says she kisses her goodbye, then hands her the comb. Other times she says that the handing her the comb was the last thing she did and doesn't mention the kissing her goodbye. But honestly, I don't think it makes a difference if Hope kissed Trenny goodbye or not, and if she did it before or after handing her the comb. The important thing here is just she handed her the comb. But Hope was being very specific about it, so I wanted to point out that she's being very specific, but also contradicting herself. We also get into Nick's next question. Wow, that is harder to say than I would have thought. This time about... So Trenny went into the school and then she came back out to tell you the trip was still on, right? Good question. Hope talks about how she watched Trenny walk into the school and gives a fairly exact range on how many yards away that was. And then Trenny and Robert come out of the school, and Trenny was wearing Robert's coat, and because Robert was so much bigger than Trenny, the coat swallowed her whole. With Hope giving an exact distance and the exact order of things, and this being 49 plus years later, generally, if there had been nothing special about that day, and again, we're talking about this day like half a century later, I'd normally consider being that exact a sign of her being wrong. Given that this ended up being the last time she ever saw her daughter, I'm willing to cut her some slack I wouldn't normally give. I'm not going to say that her being this exact is a sign that she is wrong. But I do want to point out that being this exact, saying it was 30 yards, saying I handed her comb and then kissed her goodbye, just that amount of specificity is frequently a sign that someone is either lying or is just wrong when they're telling a story. Also, this is the first mention of how much bigger of how Robert was so much bigger than Trenny. Apparently, at least in this, and we're going to get into this more later. He was just shy of a foot taller than her and 2 to 2.5 times her weight. He was supposedly 6-ish feet tall, maybe a little bit more, and 250 pounds. And she was 5'3" and in the lower 100 pounds. So, like, between like 100 and 120 pounds. When we get to the second part of this, we're going to talk a lot more about the height and weight and stuff and how those interact with each other. It is one of the key things that I think Bouchard is being, for lack of a better word, a cop about this whole thing. It's just... I don't like it, and we'll get into more of it later. But for now, just add Robert was a tall and big boy to your 2 other things that you're keeping in your head. Those being Trenny didn't know Robert before the day in question, and Hope bought the comb in question from a store.
So, yes, sir, I saw her in that coat. I also recognized that coat. It jumped off the page at me. In a
newspaper article.
So when Mike showed you the newspaper picture, you recognized that coat?
Yes, sir. It just took my breath away. I couldn't believe it had been there 40 or 50 years. And nothing been done, nothing said about it, Oh, boy.
I can imagine that would be quite shocking.
You might think I would have skipped this bit at first because it doesn't seem super important, but it does reveal one thing, and it mentions something that Nick talked about before the interview that is apparently one of the big things that helped Bouchard write his book and become convinced about Robert's guilt. Bouchard apparently found a picture from a National Park Service newspaper that shows Robert wearing the coat that is allegedly the same coat that he let Trenny borrow on the morning of this hike. This picture of him wearing the coat was when he was assisting in the search for Trenny. So obviously after she went missing. Hope confirms that the coat in that picture is the coat that Trenny was in the day she went missing, even though she does state that she only recently saw that picture for the first time, and so is trying to remember the coat almost 50 years later. As we'll likely go over as we continue, this coat and how Robert started the day with it, allegedly gave it to Trenny for at least part of the hike, and again allegedly ended up with his coat back, is seen as critical to proving something. And this isn't like a self-censor or anything like that. I'm legitimately not sure what it is supposed to prove. Bouchard is convinced that the only possible way that Robert could have gotten this coat back is when he was assaulting Trenny. In fact, it is about half of his evidence that Robert assaulted Trenny. We'll go over the other evidence later, but a big part of it is he could have only gotten it back while assaulting her. Which is just blatantly not true. Like, even on the face of it. The easiest, simplest most non-nefarious answer is Trenny could have just given Robert the coat back at some point before she went missing. None of the students who are the last reported people to see Trenny alive, as she was walking back towards the parking lot, none of them specifically mentioned if she was or was not in a coat. And yeah, we'll get into a bit why it's really. There's something that I'm just thinking about now on this second recording of this video after spending way too much time on it. We will get into it later, where if Bouchard was right and Robert took his coat back while he was assaulting Trenny, she wouldn't have been wearing a coat when these last students saw her. Yeah, well, I'm going to add to this script because I am onto something. Unfortunately, most of what I'm thinking now is about stuff in the second part of this video, or the second video. Yeah. All of what I just went over is only really worth talking about if we assume that this coat that Robert's wearing in the picture is in fact the coat he lent to Trenny the day of this hike. There's some third-hand accounts that we'll touch on at the end that say how Robert got his coat back. And I will take a moment right now to point out that story is completely incompatible with Bouchard's. And then there's this picture that almost 50 years later, Hope says the coat Robert's wearing in that photo is the coat he gave to Trenny on the day she went missing. That's it. That's all we have. That Robert ended up with his coat back. It's really flimsy evidence, to say the least. Let alone to then make the massive leap that the only possible way he could have gotten his coat back is because Trenny was assaulted.
So, were you surprised to see Trenny even with Robert Simpson Jr. that day, that he had even loaned her his coat? Was that all kind of weird to you?
I was. Because I just lived about 5 minutes from the school, and I told her about if they're going to. Neither of us expected them even to go. And I told her that if they went, that we'd run back to the house real quick and get her coat. And so that was, he made sure he came to the door ahead of her so he could tell me all about it, okay? That was just, I should have said something to me. I trust people too much, I think.
There are two basic ways to look at what Hope is saying. Again, assuming what she's saying is 100% accurate after almost half a century. Something that we just keep having to come back to and keep in the back of our mind is we're 49.25 years after the incident. Here are the bare facts as Hope lays out, stripping out as much as possible for the moment. Hope and Trenny leave for school on the morning of October 8th. Due to incoming bad weather, both of them assume that the field trip is likely going to be canceled. But if it's not, they'll quickly go back home, get Trenny a jacket, and then go back to school. It's only about a 5-minute drive. They arrive at school. Trenny gets out, and Hope gives her the comb and likely kisses her goodbye. Then Trenny goes into the school for an unknown amount of time to find out if the trip is still happening. Somehow, she gains the knowledge that it is, presumably meets up with Robert, who gives her his coat to wear for the trip, and they both go outside to tell Hope that the trip is still happening and that they don't have to go back home to get Trenny a jacket. Hope, who, remember, is convinced that Robert killed her daughter, frames them coming out as Robert making sure he came out first so he could tell Hope about how he is such a good guy and is letting Trenny borrow his coat. And Hope says that should have given her a clue about Robert's secret plans for her daughter, but she was just too trusting. Or you can frame it as they came back outside together and Robert said something along the lines of, "Don't worry, Mrs. Gibson, I'm letting Trenny borrow my coat," as in, you don't have to make a trip back to the house and get Trenny a coat because I'm letting her borrow mine. This is the first time, honestly, out of many in the interview where, because the framework and the basic assumption is Robert murdered Trenny, an action he did is taken in the worst possible light. This is one of not quite as many examples of this, where him doing something is taken in the worst possible light as proof that he killed Trenny, when the only reason you would assume he did it in the worst possible light is because you already believe he killed Trenny. I.e., Robert let Trenny borrow his coat and made sure people knew about it because he had plans to kill Trenny, and he killed Trenny, and we know that because he let her borrow his coat. It's a circle. It's circular reasoning. We know he killed Trenny because if you assume he killed Trenny and look at some of his actions with that assumption, then you can see it in bad faith and bolster, you can eliminate all other possibilities. If Trenny and Robert were friends, then that second framing that I mentioned, where he's trying to show Hope that she doesn't have to make the trip back home, then back to the school, is the one that makes sense. That is the framing that makes sense if you assume they're friends. And even if they're not friends, it's a fine framing to assume if you assume that Robert is just a nice guy. A third thing that you could think of that points toward this non-nefarious framing is remembering that Robert and Bob are friends. And Robert knows that Trenny's Bob's little sister. And so even if they're basically strangers, he's probably still willing to help his friend's little sister. Honestly, I don't think there's anything about this supposed encounter that's worth talking about, let alone talking about for as long as we have, or as long as they did in this interview. It's only being brought up because Hope thinks Robert killed her daughter, and that's it.
So the comb, again, is something people always say that it's an item that Trenny would never have given away or loaned to somebody. Is that your understanding as well?
Right, honey, she would. No one ever touched anything that belonged to Trini. It was, everybody just knew that it was Trini's. You don't touch Trini's things. Nobody. She was a very orderly, meticulous person that was everything just had to be so and in its own order, in its proper place. And no, she would never hand her comb ever. Nobody ever that I knew of before this happened ever even touched her comb, had any reason to, as far as I know. But and everybody knew that she carried it in her back pocket.
So Trenny wouldn't even let you touch the comb. She kept it close so much. Is that right?
Well, I could have touched it or any time I wanted to. She didn't care for me doing it.
Okay.
But somebody else, no way.
Gotcha.
We're back to talking about the comb, and I'm including this because I think this section is just weird. Firstly, something I didn't really notice, or something I noticed but didn't really think of the first time I watched the video, but when writing the script and watching the video painfully attentively, I was paying more attention to this, and I think it's worth mentioning. So, as I kind of went over earlier in the video, Nick mentions a few times that both in the first part of the video that I'm not showing and in the wrap-up that you will actually see in the second video, that while Hope was sick on the day of this call, he was just so impressed by how sharp she still was. In this section specifically, but kind of throughout her whole thing, just it's really noticeable here. I hear her slurring her words a lot. Like, a lot. Now, that could be because she's at least 80 years old, because in 1976 she had a 19-year-old child, and assuming she had said 19-year-old when she was 12, she'd be 80 in 2025. Likely she was at least a few years older, probably at least 4. We kind of hope at least 5 to 7. Which would put her in her mid-80s or early 90s, all depending on exactly how old she was when she had Bob. So it could just be she's slurring her words because she's old. Another possibility is at some point she had a stroke and or has some form of dementia, both of which would be common in a person of her age. Well, maybe not common, but at least, like, you would be like, oh, okay, sure. I mean, I suppose she could also be drunk while on the call. I bring all of this up primarily because I don't know of any illness that makes you slur your words like that. I'm sure there are some. I just don't know them. The idea that Robert Simpson Jr. is a murderer rests almost solely on Hope's testimony, which means you have to accept her testimony as true. And if Nick and Bouchard can point out how sharp she is for someone of her age and make a big deal about that, I can and will point out things that contradict that. As I mentioned, though, what she's actually saying in this section, slurring aside, is weird as shit. Trenny's a very orderly person, and everybody knew not to touch anything of Trenny's. She wouldn't ever loan anything of hers out. She didn't want anyone to touch anything. And in one of the few parts of this section of the interview with Hope, Nick does something that I'm really glad he did, and I wish he'd done more things like this. He seemingly picks up on how what she's saying now clashes with the earlier statement of the last thing I ever did for her was I handed her her comb. And he asks about that. And Hope backpedals and stumbles through a, well, she didn't care if I touched her stuff, but nobody else. Um, there's some stuff I want to talk about regarding what I think has happened in Hope's mind about Trenny, but I'm going to save that for a specific point where it has more relevance to what she is saying. Um, but this is kind of part of it, so I wanted to point it out. Just as I don't think that Hope is accurate when saying this day was the first time Trenny ever did anything without her family, I don't think that Trenny was this against other people touching her stuff. Um, I believe that Hope, like I think Hope believes what she is saying. Um, I just don't think it's accurate to who Trenny Gibson actually was.
I just want people to know what the real facts that went on, because nobody's known. Everything's made up facts and lies, you know.
I agree. It's well, and that's what we're trying to kind of get to the bottom of here is like,
This is another bit where I've kind of gone back and forth on if I should include it or not. Um, Honestly, I really, really feel for Hope. Even as I don't like the implication she's putting out, both in this section and this interview as a whole. It's true. There's a lot of conjecture and non accurate information about what happened to her daughter. And I can't even begin to imagine how hard that is on her. Um, it it's got to be like opening up the wound fresh every time, and I can't imagine how that wound would be. Um, but on the other hand, you have to look at everything she's saying through the lens that she's convinced, possibly by Bouchard, that Robert murdered Trenny. The real facts are the ones that back up this story, and the made up facts and lies include everything else. So, as much as I feel for her, I am sure that if she looked at this analysis, she would say that I'm just making up facts. Honestly, I hope she doesn't ever see this video. I think it's very unlikely that she will, but I hope she never does, because I don't want to contribute to her pain. Um, but I do have to call out this bullshit.
like, why do you think Robert Simpson Jr. was the one that she stayed with all day?
Well, he was the one that gave her the coat, and no doubt asked her to sit with him. But Trini was not a person that, she was just interested in going to school. And the only reason she wanted to go to begin with was because she wanted to study and be a landscape architect when she went to UT, okay? That was the only reason. She had never been on any type of field trip and or never asked to go. She was satisfied with being at home with family, watching Little House on the Prairie, stuff like that. And with her dog Mitzi, she'd had Mitzi since 1969, and she took her with her everywhere she went.
So
So that was so. She
do you
was
think
she was a very unusual person compared to the regular normal teenager, you know.
Okay, we're cutting out about 25 seconds because Nick asks a very long and admittedly good question. But where this clip picks up, you get the main gist of what he's saying. Hope continues to paint a picture of Trenny where she never goes out and does anything. She has her 7-year-old dog who's just her absolute best friend. And outside of school, she just stays home with her family. Her mom, who's a homemaker, we probably would have called her a housewife at the time. Her dad, when he's not traveling for work, her 19-year-old brother before he joined the Navy at a very unclear time, her 14-year-old sister, and her 5-year-old brother. Which I think the fact that she has a 5-year-old brother is important for why Hope thinks of Trenny the way she does. But again, I am waiting for a specific moment to talk about what I think has happened with Hope and her memories of Trenny. But at this moment, I do want to make it clear that according to her mom, Trenny was very happy staying at home all the time in a family that sounds very stereotypical for that era, and her very young sibling. Quick side note, apparently, at some point, either during the summer or maybe some evenings or something, Trenny apparently had a part-time job. Most videos that I've seen on this case mention that because they make a big deal out of a ring that we're going to talk about a bit later. For whatever reason, Hope doesn't mention Trenny having a job ever during this interview. Which makes the discussion she has later about this ring all the weirder. We will talk more, and she does that because it would clash with the whole. This trip was the first time Trenny was ever alone without family in her entire life. We'll talk more about how this clashes when we get to the ring. But if Trenny never had a job, I'm not sure how she could afford this ring, and Hope is adamant that Trenny bought the ring with her own money.
did she have many friends, especially in that no?
No, just I mean, when she went to school, she was friendly with everybody and did school things, but she had never had taken part with any clubs, any special anything that was at the school. She didn't. Now the other two, her brother and sister, did. They took part in everything. Not Trenny. She was satisfied with reading and studying at home.
Okay, it is time to talk about what we've been bumping up against for the last couple of clips. Hope has built her eldest daughter into this young woman who, while being friendly with everyone, spent all of the time outside of school at home. Her older brother and younger sister, now they had active social lives, but not Trenny. She was very happy to not do that. Something I will point out, she was 11 when her youngest brother was born. I think Hope leaned really hard on Trenny to help out around the house and with her little brother, as was common at the time, because Trenny was the eldest daughter. And because Trenny disappeared before her and Hope could have a big fight about the expectations Hope was presumably putting on Trenny, I think over the decades, Hope has insulated herself in the idea that Trenny was a good girl that way. Trenny liked being at home all the time, hated when other people touched her stuff, and while she was friendly with everyone, she never wanted to do anything outside the home beyond school. I think this view of her daughter either helps or is helped by how well it slots in with the idea of her not knowing Robert before October 8th, and that Trenny was just some sweet, innocent girl who had a terrible thing happen to her. The Trenny that Hope is describing seems to lack agency in just about every aspect of her life. That doesn't really mesh well with what we know, but it does fit a stereotype. But hey, maybe Trenny was that 1 in a million child who was actually like that. Hell, maybe Trenny had some sort of neurodivergence. That could explain the weirdness her mom is talking about here. The weirdness that Trenny has with her stuff. The point is, I don't know. I don't know what Trenny was actually like. She went missing 14 years before I was born. I find it hard to believe that Trenny just happened to fit into the exact stereotype of what the perfect first daughter would be in the mid 1970s. It's a really hard thing for me to believe. Bit of a side note here, but I swear to God, if I start seeing new videos about Trenny Gibson talk about her having a neurodivergence because I mentioned it in passing here, ugh. Back to being serious though, like Hope is painting a very specific view where Trenny never left the house. She didn't have any friends. She was short. I mean, five. If she's 5'3", yeah, that. By the time she would have been a full adult, she probably would have been average height for a woman or slightly bigger. But 5'3" is seen as short. Only just over 100 pounds. Always needed a protector because in Hope's mind, her daughter was killed by Robert, and she needs to have had her daughter be the sweet, innocent thing that had something happen to her. Again, she seems to lack all agency.
So if she's on the field trip and she doesn't have a close friend in that class, do you think it's fully possible that Simpson Jr. just kind of targeted her as someone he could get close to?
Definitely. I think he had plans from the very start. Now, that's just what I don't know that for a fact. I can't prove it, but that is just how I feel about it, that he had plans from the beginning, really.
Honestly, I could have probably let this clip be part of the last one or possibly even dropped. That said, this is crazy. What Hope said here is absolutely batshit crazy. Trenny, her sweet little girl, who was friendly with everyone, didn't have a single friend out of any of these 32 other students. And Robert, who, remember, according to Hope, didn't know Trenny before this day, had picked Trenny out from the beginning as a target to do fill in the blank to. No, like, this isn't a self-censor. Once again, this is me pointing out what he was supposedly targeting her for is not ever mentioned. This is wild conjecture and is only something you would think of because you are convinced he is guilty. But also, you're using this conjecture to help you build the case that he's guilty. Almost every single piece of evidence against Robert is like this. Evidence. If you assume he is guilty and see his actions through the lens that he is guilty, you can interpret his actions in a way to argue that he's guilty. So if you assume the answer, then you can make the argument.
Okay, I want to move forward in time a little bit after Trenny has disappeared and the search is kind of happening. It sounds like Simpson Jr. was always he was kind of everywhere. Sometimes he would be at a ranger station where your ex-husband was. Sometimes he'd be at your house. Did you notice that you
Right.
saw him around a lot, and was that kind of weird?
Well, now I stayed at the ranger station and at the motel, so I had no idea that he was going to my house answering my phone. I got that when Tina made that testimony to the Park Service, and when she told me, uh, I had no idea that he was even doing that. Okay, just but whenever I did know that he had picked up my son Bob Jr. from the airport when he came in from the Navy, and I knew that he did pick him up and took him then home. And Bob Jr. was sick whenever he got in, had to go to the doctor then that week. But anyway, supposedly he wanted to stay the night and make sure that Bob Jr. was okay. Uh, so
So, one of the big things that Robert is said to have done after Trenny went missing is something I think, at least with hope, this is about as close as they get to talking about it. We know he's spending time searching for Trenny, or Bouchard claims he's doing something else, but we'll get to that later. Right now, we're taking the framing that he is searching. Um, and Bob flies in from the Navy, and Robert offers to go pick him up so that Bob Sr. and Hope can stay at the motel that's being used as the Rangers' headquarters. Tina, who, remember, is Trenny's little sister, has this story that Hope and Bob Sr. either have her tell park rangers, as she mentions here, or the detectives, or the FBI. It's unclear who she told this story to, how many times she told it, if she told it to multiple groups of people. But it's said to have been ignored, so it doesn't really matter. According to Tina, Robert stops by their house a few times, talks about how it might have been this other guy who is confirmed to have been at school that day, who's also a friend of Bob's, and Trenny may or may not have been dating at the time. But that other boy has been confirmed to have been at school that day, or she ran off with, quote, a horny hitchhiker, which implies that she met up with this person who's hitchhiking, and then, like, hitchhikers don't have a car. And then he would mention how his dad was an assistant U.S. attorney. He showed her his knife in a threatening way, and even took a call at the Gibson house from some other woman at least once who was calling for him. Honestly, I don't put a lot of stock in this story. I'll talk about this more when we get to Bouchard's part of the interview, but this is just one of those moments where Robert is being a dumbass, almost trying to get caught, as opposed to other moments in this same time period where Robert is supposedly doing all these super intelligent things to make sure he can get away with the crime. I don't think this story happened because honestly, it sounds like something straight out of a movie. Also, as Nick kind of alludes to, and he talks about more later, for Robert to be visiting the Gibson house, essentially taking his run of the place, as well as to put in time in the search area that we know he put in, he has to be going nonstop for days on end. Now, we're going to talk more about the ride that Robert gave Bob soon. That's another moment where Robert is makes these huge obvious mistakes. Again, if you first assume he's guilty, he's doing huge obvious mistakes. If he's not guilty, they're kind of whatever. Either way, apparently when they reached the Gibson house, it was quite late. And between the time and Bob feeling sick, Robert either asked to stay the night, or Robert offered to stay the night to help Bob. It's not quite clear how that happened, but somehow Robert ended up staying the night. The big deal that is made out of something that happened in the car ride, we're gonna get into it in just a moment. But I find it really weird that Bob was supposedly very suspicious of Robert because of that car ride, but still let him stay the night at his house. Also, these two events are all the evidence that we have that Robert visited the Gibson house after Trenny went missing. So it's important to talk about. Yeah.
Well,
Okay.
prior to that, is it not true that when Robert Simpson Jr. went to go pick up your son, Bob Jr., at the airport, and then they were driving back to your house, didn't your son notice Trenny's comb on his dashboard?
Like the first thing, as soon as he got in the car, yes.
First thing. Okay.
I'm breaking this up because the next clip is going to be on the longer side, so I didn't want to just make it even longer. So we're first going to talk about the comb. Great. According to the story, as soon as Bob gets into Robert's vehicle, he noticed that Trenny's comb was on the dashboard. The comb that Hope had bought from a store. I'm going to skip ahead a moment to talk about this. So apparently, Bob confronts Robert about Trenny's comb being on his dash, to which Robert answers she let him borrow it. If we make the two assumptions that Hope set up at the beginning of this, that would raise a huge red flag. Remember, according to Hope, she had handed Trenny her comb that morning, the last thing she did before Trenny left the car. It's the last thing that this grieving mother ever did for her daughter. This is part of why I pointed out why being as specific as she was is often a sign of someone not being honest. If Hope had given Trenny the comb that morning, Trenny couldn't have let Robert borrow it. Which, remember, Trenny doesn't let anyone borrow it. Unless Trenny let Robert borrow it during the hike, and he didn't mention that for some reason. Hope sees her as this stereotype of what the perfect teenage daughter in the 70s would have been. But here are two other possibilities for how Trenny's comb ended up on Robert's dash. Possibility number one, it wasn't Trenny's comb. It was another Stanley Ratcatcher 7-inch comb owned by someone else that had let Robert borrow it. Possibility number two, at some point during the day, before she gave Robert his coat back, Trenny had put her comb in the pocket of the coat. And when she gave him back the coat, she forgot her comb was in there. She was a 16-year-old fucking girl. It's believable she would do that. Later, before picking up Bob, Robert's getting into his car, feels the comb in his pocket, takes it out, and absentmindedly tosses it on the dashboard, where Bob will later find it. And by the time that Bob does find it several days later, Robert's forgotten about finding it in his coat, so he just assumes Trenny must have let him borrow it because there's no other way he could think of where it would be in his vehicle. That's fine. Bob takes this comb, but apparently he's satisfied enough by that answer that, again, he's okay with Robert spending the night at his house when they get there. We'll get into Bob's identification of the comb in a little bit. But it's really important to Bouchard's story that Robert spends the night at the Gibson house that night in particular because of something that Bob allegedly saw. But this moment with the comb, it's held up as one of the key clues that Robert is the killer, and it's how Bob got so suspicious he came to a conclusion that, again, we're going to talk about in a minute. That said, between the time he found this comb and came to this conclusion about it being Trenny's and how Robert must have gotten it and what happens a little bit later, he was satisfied enough and not suspicious enough to let Robert spend the night. I really think that breaks the through line we're supposed to believe for why Robert is the killer. And again, both this comb thing and this other thing are moments where Robert the killer is being incredibly stupid and almost acting like he wants to get caught. While again, during this time frame, he's also doing very smart things to make sure he's never caught. You can't have it both ways. Robert is either so incompetent that he'd leave a prized possession of his victim in plain view in his vehicle while going to pick up the older brother of said victim from the airport. Or he's smart enough to do what Bouchard claims he was doing by not pretending to look for Trenny while actually leaving false scent trails. He can't be smart enough to pretend to look for Trenny and leave false scent trails and be dumb enough that he would leave the item she is most identified with, allegedly, on his dashboard when he goes to pick up her older brother. Like, no. Both of those didn't happen.
Yes.
And how did your son know that it was Trenny's comb? Because a Stanley rat tail comb.
He knew everything that Trenny had.
Okay.
She knew everything he had because when they went to purchase anything, they all three would go together, and the other two, Bob Jr. and Tina, wouldn't buy anything if Trenny didn't like it. Okay, so
That's exactly the answer I wanted. Okay.
okay, well, you got it, honey. You got it.
Boy,
Okay,
she
so
knows that to be fact, let me tell you.
That's right.
So two things happen here, and for some reason, all the guys on the call just take what Hope says here and just unquestioningly believe her. Remember, Bob has been in the Navy for some unknown amount of time. In Nick's opening bits, he says Bob was in Navy boot camp when he had to come home because Trenny went missing. There's also an event I originally thought we were going to talk about, but it doesn't really fit in anywhere, that happened a year before she went missing, where Bob is gone. And it's kind of implied that he's already gone to the Navy a year before she goes missing, which would make sense because he would have been 18 then. So he would have gone directly into the Navy after high school rather than waiting a year. Either way, I call bullshit on what she's saying. Bob did not know absolutely everything his sister owned, and she didn't know absolutely everything he owned. I'm not going to get into why, because I think it's pretty clear why the idea that two siblings, 3 years apart, know by heart absolutely everything each other owns, so much that they can point it out at a glance in an unfamiliar setting, that's a bullshit notion. Secondly, remember, this is happening in the context of how Bob could identify the comb. Hope talks about how whenever Trenny or Bob or Tina wanted to buy something from a store, all three of them would go to the store and Trenny had the final say on if they bought anything or not. Remember, Trenny, the one who always needs a protector, is the one who has the final say on if her or either of her siblings buys anything. The implication from the way that Hope talks about this at this point is that Bob knows that comb is Trenny's because Bob was with Trenny when she bought the comb. Except about 10 minutes prior in this interview, Hope flat out says she bought Trenny and Tina that exact comb from the store. So Bob wasn't there when Trenny bought it because Trenny didn't buy it. This also brings us back to this comb was bought from a store. At least two of them, according to what Hope said earlier. Therefore, there's no reason to believe that no one else in that area could not have had the same fucking comb. Guys, folks, peoples, humans, or any non-humans who are watching, I don't know. There's no reason to believe that the comb that was on Robert's dashboard was Trenny's comb. None. Just none. But even if it were, there are other reasons, other ways he could have gotten it. Now, we're going to skip Bouchard asking Hope to confirm that she identified the comb as Trenny's. Hope says yes, because she bought the thing, and she would know that comb today if you showed it to her. Even though, just before, she brought up a story in such a way that it implies that Trenny bought the fucking comb. And again, acting like this isn't a comb bought from a fucking store that carries multiples of this kind of comb. They keep acting like it's this unique, one-of-a-kind fucking plastic comb. It's not.
And when you talk to your son later, what did Simpson Jr. What was his excuse for having Trenny's comb in his car?
Oh, she had loaned it to him, and as a matter of fact, he had combed his filthy, greasy hair with it, and it was covered in that grease, black grease. I almost threw up.
Sorry. Okay.
So did Bob Jr. did that set off some red flag when you talked to him? Did that set off some red flags in his mind that because I'm assuming he knew Trenny wouldn't let her comb out of her hands. So was he kind of thinking that this is odd that Trenny's comb would be found here in Simpson Jr.'s vehicle?
No, he knew that there was something that he recognized that there had to be more to it. He had absolutely no doubt that Trini had loaned her comb to nobody. He knew that.
This is the first time that Robert's supposed slovenliness is mentioned. He's gross and he doesn't wash his hair enough. This is part of how Bob knew that Trenny wouldn't have let Robert borrow her comb. She wouldn't have let anyone borrow her comb, but especially not someone who has gross hair. And Robert is said to have used it, and it was so gross that Hope almost threw up when seeing it again. Obvious hyperbole is obvious, but still. Once again, this threw up red flags for Bob and made him very suspicious of Robert, but not suspicious enough to not let Robert stay the night.
So he's already kind of on high alert when he gets picked up by Simpson
you better
Jr.
believe it. And then when he saw those scratch marks, from then on, he knew. He knew.
Let's talk about that. So, your son wasn't feeling well, so they went back to your house, and Simpson Jr. was going to stay the night. And I guess he was undressing, getting into his boxer shorts or something, and your son saw scratch marks on Simpson Jr.'s thighs, like vertical scratch marks, right?
Up and down the insides of his legs, yes, sir.
And when your son asked him how he got those, what did he say?
Oh, he had gotten them in the woods from the briars, and that was his answer. Oh, he had gotten them in the woods.
And did
I got them in the woods, okay? But anyway,
did your son buy that excuse?
No, he didn't buy it. That's the reason he came to me straight. That was the reason he came straight to me and told me. He said, and Mom, he's got scratch marks up and down the inside of his legs.
And this is the event that happened when Robert stayed the night. He took his pants off knowing he had scratches on his thighs in front of the brother of his victim. Or at least, if we're counting him as guilty, that's what happened. I don't remember if they talk about it anywhere around here or not, but the reason why Bob knew the excuse that it was caused by brambles while searching for Trenny that Robert gave Bob, Bob knew it was wrong because Bob knew for a fact that Robert only wears one pair of pants, and they're a heavy work pant. And there's no way you would get scratches like that in the woods wearing those pants. Bob knew this, despite being gone to the Navy for, again, some amount of time prior to this. Those scratches paired with Trenny's comb made Bob so suspicious that he went directly to Hope to tell her all of this. So, again, this is kind of This kind of continuing the whole Robert was a gross person. He only wore one single pair of pants. I'm going to go a little bit into that more later in Bouchard's part because, yeah, just that is how I'm going to frame this. But remember, Bob is apparently so sick, in the next day or two, he's going to be taken to the hospital. And, like, supposedly these are both inner thighs. They're deep parallel marks. And Robert forgot about them? Like, I don't get. I don't understand the chain of logic that is Robert puts Trenny's comb on his dashboard, and then later he offers to go pick up Bob, so Bob Sr. and Hope can stay at the motel to get Bob from the airport, and then he does so. Bob sees the comb and is suspicious enough of Robert to take the comb, but not suspicious enough that by the time they get to the Gibson house, Bob is fine with Robert staying the night. And he has to be fine with that, because Robert has to stay the night so Robert can derobe in front of Bob so Bob can see these scratches. I don't understand how that chain of events happened. There's going to be a really big deal made about the scratches later, and Robert spending the night this night, and it has to be late enough, and Bob has to be sick enough that Robert offers or asks, or Bob asks or offers for Robert to spend the night, and they both have to agree, because we need Robert to take his pants off in front of someone so we can know about these scratches. The more I think about this, the harder it is for me to believe that this happened.
So you got a series of things here. You got the comb being found in Simpson Jr.'s car. You got the scratch marks on his legs. You have your daughter who was at home alone while the search was going on, and then Robert Simpson shows up and he's there asking her questions and answering your telephone. Did all these things just set off alarm bells in your head that this guy might be a suspect?
Sure. Yeah. Yes, and we kept telling him and trying to get him investigated, and he was too young, they told us. I mean, just shrugged it off like no big deal.
Really? So you went to the...
at the time. I don't know at the times that we tried to get him to question him. Yeah.
So you went to the NPS or the FBI multiple times with this evidence, and they didn't care?
Oh, to both.
Wow.
To both. My husband went to both.
Okay, we have to talk about Robert Simpson Sr. for a moment. There's a lot of heavy implication going on in what Hope just said, so we're going to break it down and talk about Robert's dad. Hope is saying that Bob Sr., her ex-husband, went to both the National Park Service's law enforcement arm and the FBI with Tina and Bob's stories to get them to investigate Robert. Earlier she was saying that her and Bob Sr. had brought Tina to them. Now she's saying that Bob Sr. went to them. Anyway, she then claims that both agencies were approached multiple times, and every single time they refused to investigate Robert, saying that he was too young to be questioned. And there are few things that need to be said about this that are odd. Firstly, no one mentions how old Robert is in 1976. He's friends with Bob, which implies he's closer to 19, but he's still in high school, which implies he's younger than Bob. In fact, Robert and Trenny go on the same field trip, which implies that he's actually 16 like Trenny is. I think it's fair to assume that Robert is 16, 17, 18, or 19 in 1976. It doesn't really matter much where in that age range he is, just he's probably one of those four ages. If it's those latter two ages, 18 or 19, there's nothing that he would be too young for regarding an investigation. If, on the other hand, he is 16 or 17, there are a few things he might actually be too young for. He might be too young to be tried as an adult, depending on the exact charge, or what the exact charge would have been, and exactly how being charged as an adult did or did not work in 1976 between North Carolina and Tennessee. I don't know the details about that. Also, if he were 16 or 17, law enforcement may not have been able to interrogate him without a parent present. Again, I don't know. But I have seen that put forward in the comments of the video this interview is part of as what Hope could have meant. And this is where we get into the Robert Simpson Sr. of it all. He was an assistant U.S. attorney, which, as far as I can tell, is the federal version of an assistant district attorney. I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know. I've seen it claimed quite often, including by Bouchard, that the reason why Robert Jr. wasn't investigated is because Robert Sr. prevented it. And I want to make it really crystal clear there's no publicly available evidence that says anything to that effect. I'm not saying that there's some evidence that's not released to the public that says he prevented any investigation. I can't rule out the possibility that such evidence does exist and we haven't seen it. The proof that Robert Sr. must have stopped an investigation into his son is because people like Bouchard are convinced that Robert Jr. is guilty. He was never investigated. The NPS and FBI had access to the same information that Bouchard et al. Have access to. They have access to more. Robert Jr. was never investigated. Robert Sr. was a AUSA at the time. Therefore, Robert Sr. must have stopped the investigation. There are a lot of assumptions in that chain of reasoning, and that conclusion is one of several possibilities. Yes, it is possible that Robert Sr. actively prevented an investigation. It's possible that someone that Robert Sr. worked with actively prevented an investigation. I have a kitten trying to join me. It is possible that the NPS and FBI decided on their own not to pursue that line because of Robert Sr.'s job. It's also possible that the NPS and FBI had information that made him think that Robert Jr. was not a suspect in any way, shape, or form. It's also possible that Robert Jr. was 16 or 17 and they would have needed a parent present, and Robert Sr. would have made sure that they stuck so closely to the book that they didn't think it would be worth it. And or they couldn't get a warrant and knew they couldn't cut the corners that they'd normally cut. So, while I can't ultimately say for certain that Robert Sr. did not abuse his position to squash an investigation into his son, it is only one of several possibilities. I don't find it likely because I find it hard to believe that no one ever came forward to say that Robert Sr. was involved in this disappearance in any way, shape, or form, either since he retired or since he died. Because Robert Sr. has been dead for like 5 years. He was also celebrated as doing a great job in his post, and it was noted as he was the longest serving AUSA in the entire United States when he retired. The way it's worded, he might have been the longest serving at the time of his retirement ever. I don't know on that part, but at least when he retired, he was the longest serving. Saying that he abused his position to stop an investigation into his son, and the only reason why his son was not charged and convicted of murder. Saying that's beyond reckless. Just mind-bogglingly beyond reckless.
That's incredible. Did you ever think of trying to, I don't know, take this public, maybe talk to a newspaper or the media to get this information out?
No, I didn't. There was media all over the place, so I just thought that it would be taken care of. I had no idea that it would just be pushed aside,
This is another section that I was tempted to skip over, but ultimately I'm deciding not to because I think it's really telling. Nick follows up Hope's answer about going to the NPS and FBI and being rejected by asking her if she ever went to the media. She says she didn't, and just gives some really wishy-washy explanation for there being media all around, so she just figured it would work itself out. What I think that actually really strongly points to at the time that this was going on is she wasn't convinced that Robert had anything nefarious to do with this. The Watergate scandal had just ended 2 years before. Journalists would have salivated at being presented a story where a teenage girl goes missing on a class trip due to a predator among her peers, and the federal government is refusing to even look into that possibility because the predator's father happens to be an AUSA. That would have made a career. And maybe Hope wouldn't have thought of that. Maybe. But if Bob Gibson Sr. was truly convinced enough that he went to the NPS and FBI several times, and every single time he was turned away, from how she characterizes Bob Sr., I don't see why he wouldn't have gone to the media at that point. I think those 25 seconds that we just listened to really lays bare that this idea that Hope is convinced Robert murdered her daughter during the search, like she thought that while all this was happening, I think that's just not true. This is another case where Nick asks a really good follow-up question, but then just accepts her answer whole cloth without thinking it through. And I'm not even saying he didn't think it through in the moment. At some point he either sat down and edited this interview himself, or he had someone else do it. And part of the reason why I know it was edited, other than just it's standard practice, and Nick is a successful YouTuber, of course he of course, it's edited, but also there are cuts in this interview. It was edited. So either Nick did it himself or someone else did it. But even if it was someone else, in his opening 31 minutes of the video, where he goes over the background, he references it, and in his conclusion, he references this interview so many times he had to have listened to it after the fact, at least a couple of times, or at least had a transcript in front of him. The next minute of the interview is Hope clarifying that she was told that the FBI couldn't question Robert because he was too young for them to question him. Nick also asks her if she knew what Robert Sr. did for work at the time and if she thought that could have been what was preventing this investigation. She says in 1976 she knew what Robert Sr. did, and while the idea that he was preventing it was entered into their minds, whatever the fuck that means, because the FBI told her in Trenny's room that they would leave no stone unturned, she trusted the FBI. We just went over this, so I don't feel like there's anything to add by essentially just repeating me from before the last clip.
Wow. So I'll have one more thing, and then if Mike wants to ask you anything, but I just want to get it one more time. When you saw that picture, the newspaper photograph of Robert Simpson wearing that large coat, you are without a doubt certain that is the same coat you saw Trenny wearing the last time you saw her.
There is no doubt in my mind that she was wearing. I mean, that was an immediate, when I saw that coat, of exactly what coat it was, who it belonged to, and why it was on him. It had her scent. I mean, that was an automatic thought that at the instant I saw that coat, and I thought, oh my gosh, for 50 years that's been right there. Nothing done.
This segment is included because it shows the picture in question. As you can see, it's a bad black and white photo that doesn't have a lot of detail. It's clearly from a very old newspaper that has aged, and it's a picture of it. We've already talked a good deal about it, about what I think about this coat, but still, the idea that just off of that picture, Hope knew for a fact that it was the exact same coat she last saw almost 50 years ago, just, it beggars belief. Beyond that, this bit is important because she mentions that she knew instantly that he was wearing it because it had Trenny's scent on it. Again, this is something that we're going to be talking more about when we get into Bouchard's section, because he makes a really big deal out of Robert wearing the coat. Well, as Bouchard would put it, he was helping search. He is the one putting the quotes around helping search. I see no reason why we shouldn't believe that Robert did help in the search.
Hey, hi, Hope. This is Rob. Thank you very much. Honor to talk to you as always. Could you tell us, because you're the one that was there, and the reports. That's great. But what was the weather like whenever at the time you got up there? What was the weather like?
Oh my gosh, I've never seen it rain so hard on us all the way up there. I thought we'd never get there. It
Mhm.
rained so hard, and then it kept doing it. It rained. I don't know how long it rained. I just know that that night on the way up there, that I never, like I said, it didn't seem like I'd ever seen it rain so hard. I don't know how my husband got us there.
We now have the first of basically 3 questions Rob, who is apparently an expert in dog tracking, has for Hope. I say apparently not because I have any reason to doubt it, but because I don't know him outside of this interview. Like, I know I've never heard of him before, and I haven't gone and looked him up. I see no reason to doubt his expertise, though. He asked a question about the weather, both because of the story of the impending bad weather being the reason why they thought the trip might be canceled that morning and why Trenny needed a jacket, but also, as you'll see, so he can evaluate how the dogs might have done. We know that as of the start of the school day, the weather was supposed to get bad at a nebulous later time. We know that the kids were supposed to be back to the parking lot by 3:30, and we know that by the time Bob Sr. and Hope were arriving, it was 8 or 9 that night. Hope says it was raining when they arrived, and I fully believe that. She goes on about how it was raining more than she'd ever seen before. And I don't believe that part, to be completely honest. I think she remembers it as raining more than she'd ever seen before, but I think the reason she remembers it that way is a mix of, at the time, she and her husband were driving through rain because they'd been told that that their daughter was missing, and at this point, depending on exact times we don't have, her daughter was missing for between 4.5 and 6 hours. So of course she's going to experience the rain as harder than it probably was. And I think all of that is also mixed with the fact that she's remembering this 49 years later about the drive to what would ultimately be a fruitless search. So I think, in short, on this Friday night, it was raining. It was probably quite a bit of rain. And due to the circumstances at the time and how memory has worked over the last 49 years, I think Hope remembers it as being the worst rain ever. But I'm sure it was a normal amount of just solid rain.
And when you got up there, when you got up there to the area, were there any canines or search dogs at that time when you first arrived at the scene?
No, sir. No.
Okay, thanks. What do you know approximately when the canines did arrive to do the search?
I believe maybe on Saturday, but Saturday it was so bad. It's like foggy and all that. They brought
Right.
in helicopters and everything, but they couldn't use them because it's so foggy. It was another miserable day. Okay.
So they couldn't use them.
Oh, and by the way, Simpson was down. He would come down to the station. They wouldn't let us go up on the mountain. They said that we would hinder in the search. Okay, we wanted to go, but they wouldn't let us. But
they let.
Way,
They let.
Anyway, Simpson, when he came down there, he had the coat on. I wasn't even, you're not thinking that, anything like that could be possible. You're not even thinking like that whenever your child's missing. My concentration was on finding her. So it didn't dawn on me about the jacket when he was down there.
Okay, Rob. The fifth and final person in this story, named Robert, asks his second question. He tries to do a couple of follow-ups, but Hope is so focused on saying what she's saying, she runs right over him. So let's go over this about minute and a half. Well, in my script I say real quick. There are a few pages, so I'll let you decide if this is quick or not. Rob wants to know when the dogs that helped in the search arrived. Hope tells him it was Saturday. As we just went over before this most recent clip, it was Friday night, or Friday afternoon when Trenny went missing. She then starts talking about how the weather was bad on Saturday as well, about how it was so foggy that the helicopters that were brought in couldn't be used. Rob tries to ask if that means the dogs couldn't be used on Saturday, but Hope is already starting to change the subject and ignores him. Also, side note, I really fucking hate how she says okay as she's finishing a point. I don't even want to try and do an imitation of it. There's just something about her tone and inflection, even when I have in past takes imitated it. Just something about that tone and inflection hits me exactly wrong, and I hate every part of it. It made listening to this part of the interview painful. Anyways, I think this is the only time in the entire interview where she runs over a follow-up question while changing topics. And she does it twice in this segment. She really feels like she has to say that while she's at the Rangers headquarters at the motel, she refers to at the motel a few times as where the Rangers set up searching, and at the motel is not on the mountain, but that's all we know. We don't know how near or far to the mountain at the motel is. And keep in mind, when she says that she's going, when she's driving the Friday night, they go to the headquarters, not to the mountain itself. Because Klingman Dome, I think, is in Tennessee, it would have to be on the Tennessee side. So this is something I'm kind of thinking about, and it's going to affect something a bit later. Sorry, I'm making a big deal of, like, where is the motel? Anyways, she feels like she has to say, well, she's at the Rangers headquarters at the motel. Robert was there. She says that her and Bob Sr. were not allowed on the mountain because they would interfere. And she never goes on what does interfere mean. But Robert was allowed. Of course he was. He wasn't, as far as anyone knew, he wasn't involved in this. Rob tries to jump in a second time with a follow-up to have her expand on what she just said. I think he wants to establish that Robert is allowed to help the search, and he's sometimes at the headquarters and sometimes on the mountain searching for Trenny. But again, Hope runs over his follow-up question to slightly change the subject again. At the second time of being talked over, Rob looks visibly frustrated. As soon as he can successfully jump in, he does and says he only has one more question. But what Hope says when talking over Rob the second time is how Robert was wearing the coat. She knows that for sure. But it was just not something you think about at the time because you're so busy. It's extremely important to Bouchard's pet idea that Robert was on the mountain with the coat he had loaned to Trenny. So Hope making sure to say she remembers that she noticed at the time Robert was wearing the coat she had seen him give to Trenny the day before. Then she's got to add something in to explain why she didn't make a big deal out of it at the time. There's a few times like this where she's saying things that I feel like she's saying them to just kind of hit a couple of things that Bouchard absolutely needs for his pet idea. But then she has to add something because it wasn't true at the time. Like, she wasn't thinking about this at the time because she didn't think Robert was a killer at the time. So she's got to add in something to explain why she's making a big deal out of it now, 49 years later, and why she didn't on October 9th, 1976. Also, Robert wearing the coat in front of the only person who was there who had seen him give the coat to Trenny is another moment where he's being so stupid and leaving these clues. And this moment of dumbassery is as he's doing the absolute genius move that Bouchard says he's doing. I know we've kind of talked about this coat to death by this point, but it is one of the absolute linchpins of Bouchard's idea. So he needs to talk about it a lot. So you buy everything he says about it. As I've said before, I think it's either a similar coat but not the same coat, or what I consider more likely is at some point during the trip, Trenny gave Robert his coat back. And he wore it when he was at the search headquarters because it was early October, pushing mid-October, and the weather fucking sucked. By what Hope was saying, the weather sucked. So of course he's gonna wear it. Of course he's gonna wear his good coat when tromping through the wilderness looking for his classmate in early to mid-October in shitty weather. Just as David Paulides has to ignore simple explanations in the cases he focuses on to make them sound stranger, Bouchard needs to ignore the idea that Trenny gave Robert the coat back on her own free will, because that is a more likely explanation than Bouchard's idea that Robert took the coat back while assaulting Trenny. And again, earlier, what I realized when reading this script, when we'll get into it a little bit later, but there is a timeline discrepancy in how Bouchard is setting up this timeline. And he doesn't seem to realize it. We're going to skip about a minute of video because Rob asks his question. Hope goes off on a small tangent about how Bob Sr. was trying to get Billy Graham to bring in his search and rescue dogs. But she doesn't say if he's Bob Sr. or Billy Graham or fucking Santa Claus, was told they already have dogs. So they didn't need to, Billy Graham's dogs didn't need to be brought in. Since she just blatantly doesn't answer Rob's question at all, he just re-asks the question, and we're going to pick back up on that second asking.
Did they have any? Did the
Go with
dog?
that one.
Did the dogs have any insignia on the harnesses, or did they? I mean, anything that would indicate they were search and rescue dogs, or what kind of dogs were they? I'm curious on that. Would that you've seen? You know.
They were just regular dogs, you know. That, as far as I know now, and they were not professional. I know that there was no professional trained that strictly for hunting, searching for someone. They were just dogs.
Rob wants to know everything he can about the dogs that helped in the search. He wants to know if Hope remembers any insignia they had, what breed of dogs they were, anything that she could possibly tell him that she can remember 49 years later. He treats it like this is a really long shot, but he needed to ask anyways. She tells them that she knows now that there were no professional search dogs, and that these dogs were just regular dogs. Later on, they're going to make a lot of hay out of the fact that the search dogs used were just dogs, so it's really important to include this here. Because she says that she now knows there's no professional search dogs, and she remembers them as just regular dogs. That doesn't actually mean a goddamn thing. That is a meaningless phrase. But we're going to have one of the biggest skips in this whole thing. Bouchard brings up a ring that Trenny had that some people have made big deals about. Where did Trenny get the money for the ring, and so on and so forth. I've seen this used as part of an argument that Trenny purposely went missing to start a new life away from her family. With whoever gave her the ring. The reason why she'd have to start a new life is people have seen how Hope, what Hope says about Trenny, and we talked about later about how she was so shy and always wanted to stay home and everything like that, to be late, and they have extrapolated that into Hope and Bob Sr. Basically made Trenny into a Cinderella character, and we don't know that. And, someone had to give her the ring because it was a $600 ring. Yeah. We're going to talk a little bit about the ring after this. Hope muddles through an answer where she says she doesn't know why anyone is making a big deal about the ring, because it's Trenny's ring, or because it's Trenny that was missing. It's really hard to parse when she's thinking, why people are making a big deal about the ring because it's Trenny that's missing. Are people making a big deal about the ring in 1976? Or is she thinking that since people started to cover the case, in which case, does Hope think Trenny's still alive? It's really hard to follow what she's actually saying here, and when she's thinking these things. Yeah.
That is what I felt about it. Even though it was expensive jewelry, she designed it and had it made herself. T. Lynn made it for her. The star sapphire encased in diamonds. Yes, I can see why other girls would want it, and maybe they did get it. But they,
But no one ever called you telling you
No.
they had it. No. Okay.
No, I didn't even know that there was any big deal about it.
This is the tail end of Hope talking about the ring. I wanted to include this part because Hope says the ring Says this ring is an expensive ring that Trenny had bought for herself, and she had custom ordered it. The simple question I have is, if Trenny always stays at home and never goes anywhere other than school, how'd you get the money for this expensive ring? I've heard it said... Actually, I'm going to lift myself up. I've heard it listed as being $600 a few times. But no matter what the actual price is, according to Hope, it was expensive. If Trenny's always home and never goes anywhere other than school, how'd you get the money for that? And the money for all of the purchasing that she and Bob and Tina do together, where she has the final say on if anyone buys anything. I'm not asking this question because I think someone else bought the ring for her, like maybe a boyfriend or something or whatever. No, I'm asking it because I think this is another piece that shows that Trenny wasn't the perfect stay-at-home eldest daughter Hope makes her out to be. Too many small things go against that. There's also some talk included in this and a bit after where Hope is saying that no one ever talked to her about the ring in 1976, and this narrative about people talking to her about the ring, and apparently one of Trenny's classmates calling her a bunch of times about it. All of that is just not true. Honestly, I think this is just Bouchard having Hope perform so he can point to it when he totally ignores the ring in his idea of what happened. Like, I don't think that he is wrong in ignoring the ring, because I don't think that played into it at all. But as you'll see, there are a few times where Bouchard needs something to either have happened or not happen. And he goes to really weird things to explain it away. We'll get. I'll make sure to talk about this part more in the next video when we get to a section on it. But yeah, I think that's what's happening here. Is Bouchard needs the ring to not have mattered, and to do so, he's having Hope kind of go through this song and dance, when I don't think he has to. I think he can just say, yeah, there are some unverified stories that say people called Hope about the ring a bunch of times and things like that. I don't, and they use that as a basis to say that Trenny voluntarily disappeared, and then he could just say, I don't think that is what happened. Like, he doesn't need this. He doesn't need a definitive answer for everything. And the fact that he does kind of bites him in the ass in a few places. But either way, this is the end of Hope being in the call. Bouchard quickly goes over a few things that have apparently been said that Hope says never happened. He even finds a way to remind everyone about his book and how he's phrasing this part. I don't think any of this is worth going over. I think it's almost 2 minutes. The only thing that I do think is worth even mentioning in this bit that we're skipping over is that according to Hope, Bob was at boot camp in the Navy at the time of this trip, so he did not call Robert and ask him to look out for his little sister on this trip that he didn't know about, because some people say that's why Robert was acting the way he was towards Trenny at the time. Again, another point where Bouchard has to have an answer for everything. We're going to talk a little bit more about this part later, because it kind of sort of comes up again. Okay. The first plan was to have Hope's part of the interview and Bouchard's part of the interview as two separate parts of the same video, but we're less than halfway through the interview. We're 26 minutes and 44 seconds into it. We've got 38 minutes and 18 seconds left. When I'm writing this, I haven't filmed or edited this part, so I have no idea how long it's been to get here, but we're done. We're almost done with page 21. We're at almost 10,000 words. And I think we are pushing 2 hours and 40 minutes as of filming. And yeah. So I'm going to put an end cap on this, and we're going to have Bouchard's part be a second video. In the end, I think that Hope is telling the truth as she remembers the truth being on the day that this interview happened. I think at some point in the last couple of years, Bouchard came to her with this idea that Robert Simpson Jr. killed Trenny, and she has fit that into her view of what happened. I think she is wrong, to be clear. I just think she's an old woman who Bouchard is taking advantage of, he's taking advantage of the worst few days of her life. Yeah, I don't see why Nick is so impressed by this interview she gave. I think there are several times where he could have asked a second follow-up after his first follow-up, but instead he just took what she said at face value. Everything he says in the first part of the video and during the conclusion, which will be included next time, indicates he fully believes Hope's story as she gave it. I can't say that if I were in Nick's place during this interview, I would have done any better. If I would have done the stuff that, Monday morning quarterbacking, I say he should have done better. I don't know if I would have. I like to think I would have, but I haven't been in that particular spot, so I don't know. What I know I would have done differently is after the interview, I would have analyzed it and talked about everything that we just talked about in a condensed version, if I were Nick making the video that we're responding to, before showing the interview, and included where I thought I should have done better and what I should have done better. If I were Nick, that's what I would have done. Now, since you're seeing this while you're watching this, I've already written, filmed, and edited the second part. This video is not going to go live until after that happens. It will be out soon, if it's not out already. Probably like a week after this video goes live. If you stuck with me for this long, over 10,000 words now, please give me a like, comment about this. I've been talking for the better part of 3 hours. I am sure you have something to say. So please say it. I very much welcome it. And also, if you haven't, please just subscribe. It's just right down there. Is it down there or there? I don't remember. Not only would I really like to hear your thoughts, but also commenting and stuff. That's going to show YouTube that this is a video people are engaging with. So it's going to show it to more people. And that's going to be awesome. Okay, that is it, everyone. Thank you so much for being with me for this long. And if the second video is out, a link to it should be coming up right now. Actually, a few seconds ago.